It was early morning in the remote wilderness of Siberia, June 30th, 1908, a date that would burn itself into history and into the nightmares of those who survived. For hundreds of miles, the taiga, that vast ocean of pine and birch, stretched unbroken. No roads, no cities, just the sound of wind in the trees and the occasional cry of a distant bird. And then, without warning, the sky tore open. A blinding flash, brighter than the sun, split the morning calm. For a brief, frozen moment, it was as though the heavens themselves had ignited. Then came the roar. Eyewitnesses, some living more than 40 miles away, described it as a sky splitting in two with a wall of fire racing overhead. A searing heat washed over them, hot enough to singe hair and blister skin. And then a shock wave, not one, but several. The ground heaved and shuddered as though the earth itself had been struck. Windows shattered. People were thrown off their feet. Horses bolted in terror. In the Evenki village of Vanavara, people were hurled from chairs, kettles spilled boiling water, and a thunderclap rolled over the land, not once, but again and again, echoing like distant artillery fire. The sound was heard more than 800 kilometers away, and then silence returned. But the land had been forever changed. To understand the magnitude of what happened that day, you must first understand the place. Siberia is not just remote, it is isolation on a scale most of us cannot imagine. In 1908, much of central Siberia was unexplored wilderness. The Russian Empire controlled the land politically, but in reality, vast stretches were inhabited only by indigenous tribes, the Evenki, Yakuts, and others who moved with the seasons, hunting and herding reindeer. The Tunguska region, named after the Podkamenia Tunguska River, was a place where maps blurred into guesswork. The dense taiga forest grew thick and wild, home to wolves, bears, and countless mosquitoes that swarmed in clouds so thick they could choke a traveler. No telegraph lines, no railway tracks, no paved roads. If something happened here, it could remain unknown to the rest of the world for weeks, even years. And that's exactly what happened on that summer morning in 1908. There were no cameras, no photographs from the moment itself. Only the words of those who were there. One Evenki hunter, years later, told investigators, "We saw the sky split in two, and fire appeared high and wide over the forest. The heat was so intense, we could not stand it. Everything around us shook. The sky was clear, but we saw something like a new sun." In the small settlement of Nizhny Karolinsk, about 200 miles away, residents saw a brilliant, glowing object streaking across the sky. It left behind a trail of light so intense. Shadows appeared sharp on the ground, as though midday had arrived in the early morning. A farmer in another village recalled hearing a noise so loud, "I thought the world was ending." At some locations, the shock wave was strong enough to knock people unconscious. Others reported that the force lifted them off the ground and flung them several feet. The blast lit up the horizon in ways no one could explain. For nights afterward, skies across Europe and Asia glowed strangely, bright enough in London that people could read newspapers at midnight without a lamp. At the epicenter, an estimated 80 million trees were flattened, radiating outward in a pattern that would baffle scientists for decades. For 2,000 square kilometers, the forest lay in ruin, a circular wasteland where trunks lay snapped like matchsticks, pointing away from a central point like the spokes of a wheel. Animals were wiped out in huge numbers. Herds of reindeer were found dead, their bodies scorched. Birds had fallen mid-flight. The blast was later estimated to have been as powerful as 10 to 15 megatons of TNT, roughly 1,000 times the strength of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And yet, there was no crater, no obvious object, no smoldering remains of a meteorite, just devastation and a deepening mystery. You might think such a massive explosion would trigger an immediate investigation. But in 1908, Russia was in turmoil. The country was still reeling from the 1905 revolution, economic struggles, and political unrest. Resources were thin. The site was far from any major city, more than 800 kilometers from Krasnoyarsk, the nearest significant settlement. Reaching Tunguska meant weeks of travel by train, riverboat, and horseback through mosquito-infested swamps. And so, the world forgot. Or rather, it never truly knew. News of the explosion trickled out slowly. Strange lights in the night sky. Stories from traders and hunters. But it took more than a decade before anyone made a serious effort to investigate. In 1921, a Russian mineralogist named Leonid Kulik read scattered reports of the Tunguska blast. At the time, he was studying meteorites for the Soviet Academy of Sciences. The more he learned, the more convinced he became. Tunguska had to be the site of the largest meteorite impact in recorded history. He secured funding, barely, and set out for the region in 1927. But even with modern maps, travel was brutal. His team trudged through endless swamps, battled clouds of biting insects, and navigated rivers where ice still floated in late spring. When they finally reached the epicenter, what they saw stunned them. Kulik described a forest blown down as by a giant hand. Millions of trees flattened in a radial pattern, but in the very center, trees still stood, stripped bare branches scorched like blackened telephone poles. It was eerie, silent, and the ground? Not a single trace of the massive meteorite Kulik expected to find. Scientists later studied the pattern of fallen trees and discovered something puzzling. The central zone, where trees still stood upright but were stripped bare, suggested an airburst, an explosion several kilometers above the ground, not a direct impact. This fit with some eyewitness accounts, which described the fireball disintegrating in the sky rather than striking the earth. But if it was an airburst, where was the debris? Kulik searched for years, returning multiple times, but never found definitive meteorite fragments. Instead, he found small glassy spherules in the soil, possible remnants of vaporized rock, and evidence of intense heat in the area. Still no crater. By the 1930s, Tunguska had become more than a scientific curiosity. It was a legend, a story of a blast so powerful it flattened a forest the size of a major city, but left behind no clear explanation. Some scientists held firm to the meteorite theory. Others suggested a comet, its icy body vaporizing completely before touching the ground. And yet, there were rumors. Locals spoke of strange lights in the nights before the blast. Some claimed they saw multiple fireballs, not one. And a few whispered that the explosion was not natural at all, but something far more sinister. The year is 1927. Leonid Kulik stands at the center of devastation, a silent witness to nature's fury. For hundreds of kilometers, the trees still lie in neat, terrible rows, pointing away from the blast like an invisible compass. No crater, no boulder from space, no smoking gun. And that single detail has haunted scientists ever since. Over a century later, we still ask the same question. What exactly happened over Tunguska? The most widely accepted explanation is deceptively simple. A space rock, likely a stony asteroid, entered Earth's atmosphere at incredible speed. Some estimates suggest 27,000 kilometers per hour. As it plunged deeper, air resistance compressed the rock's surface until it reached extreme temperatures, thousands of degrees, causing it to explode 5 to 10 kilometers above the ground. This airburst would release an energy equivalent to 10 to 15 megatons of TNT, sending a shockwave racing across the forest, flattening trees outward in the now famous radial pattern. The heat would have scorched tree trunks, ignited fires, and created the strange glassy beads Kulik later found in the soil. It fits many of the observed facts. But there's still a problem. No fragments. Even in an airburst, scientists expect at least some debris. Mineral shards, fused rock, traces of nickel and iron, yet nothing definitive has ever been recovered from Tunguska. Another leading theory suggests the Tunguska object was not rock, but ice, a comet's nucleus. Comets are fragile structures, often described as dirty snowballs, made of frozen gases, dust, and organic compounds. If a comet entered the atmosphere, it could vaporize completely before striking the ground, leaving almost no solid debris. This would explain the absence of meteorite fragments, and perhaps even mysterious glowing night skies seen across Europe in the days after the event, as tiny ice crystals high in the atmosphere reflected sunlight. But skeptics point out that a comet's low density might not produce a shockwave powerful enough to cause the precise destruction pattern seen at Tunguska. In the 1970s, a Soviet geologist proposed an entirely Earth-based explanation. What if the explosion wasn't from the sky at all, but from underground? Siberia is rich in natural gas deposits, especially methane trapped beneath frozen ground. If a massive pocket of gas were suddenly released, perhaps triggered by an earthquake, it could erupt violently, igniting in the atmosphere. This could, in theory, mimic an aerial explosion and explain the absence of debris. The problem? Such an eruption would leave behind signs, burned soil layers, specific chemical residues that have not been found in significant amounts at the site. Now, we step out of accepted science and into the shadows of speculation. Nikola Tesla, inventor, visionary, and occasional self-proclaimed wielder of earth-shaking power, was, in 1908, working on experiments in wireless energy transmission at his Wardenclyffe Tower in New York. Some fringe theorists believe Tesla tested a directed energy beam, a so-called death ray, aiming at the Arctic as a demonstration for explorer Robert Peary. If miscalculated, the beam could have struck Tunguska instead. There's no solid evidence for this, and many historians dismiss it entirely. But it persists in the public imagination because it's just strange enough to feel possible. And perhaps because it's easier to imagine a human hand behind such destruction than a random rock from space. Few theories capture the imagination or skepticism more than the idea that Tunguska was the result of an extraterrestrial craft crashing or detonating intentionally. Proponents point to the strange central zone where trees were left standing upright, stripped but not blown over, as evidence of a targeted blast. Some go further, suggesting the airburst was actually the explosion of a nuclear-powered alien ship, its energy release and radiation dissipating quickly in the atmosphere. Of course, no physical alien technology has ever been found, but for UFO enthusiasts, Tunguska remains one of the most compelling smoking guns in the sky. One of the most exotic scientific proposals came in the 1970s. What if a tiny black hole, perhaps the size of an atom but with immense mass, passed through the Earth? It could, in theory, release a burst of energy as it entered the atmosphere, travel straight to the planet's interior, and exit on the opposite side, leaving no debris, no crater, only destruction in its path. The problem with this? If a black hole had passed through Earth, scientists would expect to see a second explosion where it emerged, and there is no evidence of such an event, no matter which theory you favor. One detail continues to unsettle researchers: reports of strange lights in the sky before the explosion. Multiple witnesses claim that for nights beforehand, the northern horizon glowed unusually bright, sometimes green, sometimes red, unlike normal auroras. If the object was a comet or asteroid, this could be a coincidence. Or was the Tunguska event part of a longer chain of phenomena we still don't fully understand? Over the past century, dozens of expeditions, Russian, European, and international, have returned to Tunguska. Satellite imagery, soil analysis, and even drone mapping have revealed more details of the blast pattern. In 2013, a team from the Russian Academy of Sciences suggested they may have found fragments of the impactor in the bottom of Lake Cheko, a small, oddly deep lake about 8 kilometers from ground zero. Some believe the lake itself could be an impact crater filled with water over time. But this claim is hotly debated. Others argue the lake is at least 5,000 years old, far older than the Tunguska event. Perhaps the most disturbing truth about Tunguska is not what we know, but what we don't. It is the largest impact event in recorded human history. And yet, it happened in one of the most remote places on Earth, where it harmed relatively few people. If the same event happened over London or New York or Tokyo, the loss of life would be unimaginable. We've been lucky. So far, June 30th, 1908, one moment, an untouched wilderness. The next, a scar on the Earth, so vast it can still be seen from space. A blast so powerful it shook the planet's atmosphere, yet left behind no clear fingerprints. Was a rock from space? A ball of ice from the farthest reaches of the solar system? A secret human experiment gone wrong? Or something else entirely? Over a century later, the trees have grown back. The forest has swallowed the evidence. But the question remains, and perhaps always will, because some confessions remain silent.